Title: Why haven't Japan and Europe solved energy security? Subtitle: The Order of Operations Thesis, a theory of hidden dependencies. Flint West reporting. Summary statement. Japan and Europe's economic fragilities are not isolated failures. They are downstream consequences of unresolved energy dependencies. Growth requires abundant, reliable, and resilient energy. Without that foundation, monetary stability, industrial competitiveness, and living standards remain structurally vulnerable. Section 1. Pinpoint position. Growth may be an invariant, but before growth, there is energy security. The entire world is in competition. Every nation is searching for growth. Every nation needs a strategy. But growth does not appear out of nowhere. It has prerequisites. Nations do not industrialize on ideas alone. They industrialize on abundant, reliable, and resilient energy. So before there is growth, there is energy security. Section 2. The hierarchy of invariance. Start with the hierarchy because everything else sits downstream of it. At the foundation sit physics, energy, geography, and natural resources. These are not opinions. They are not campaign slogans. They are not monetary variables. They are constraints. A nation cannot repeal geography. It cannot manufacture domestic oil and gas reserves through monetary policy. It cannot industrialize without converting energy into productive work. That is the first layer. Everything else comes later. Above the foundational layer sit productivity, technology, and growth. These do not emerge independently. They are built on access to energy. They are built on materials. They are built on infrastructure. They are built on secure supply chains. Above growth sit capital allocation, purchasing power, interest rates, and investment returns. Above that sit currency markets, debt markets, trade balances, and inflation. And finally, at the furthest downstream layer, sit the symptoms: currency weakness, capital flight, bankruptcy rates, political instability, falling living standards. That distinction matters because most debate happens at the symptom layer. People argue about currencies, they argue about debt, they argue about inflation, they argue about interest rates. But every layer is downstream of the previous one, which means there is an order of operations. Before financial stability, there must be productive growth. Before productive growth, there must be energy security. And before energy security, a nation must confront the physical, geographical, and resource constraints that determine what is possible. Section 3. Japan as a case study. Japan is a useful case study, not because Japan is uniquely broken, but because the dependency structure is unusually visible. Japan's demographic challenges, debt dynamics, currency weakness, monetary constraints, and declining living standards are often discussed as separate problems. Maybe they are not separate. Maybe they are downstream manifestations of a system whose foundational dependencies remain unresolved. Growth may be an invariant, but growth itself depends upon abundant, reliable, and resilient energy. Japan possesses limited domestic energy resources. It remains heavily dependent on imported fossil fuels. It is exposed to geopolitical choke points, and it faces severe geological constraints on one of its principal alternatives: nuclear power. These conditions are difficult, but difficulty does not remove the dependency. Japan has no choice but to construct resilient workarounds against physics, energy scarcity, geography, and resource dependence. That is not a moral judgment. It is not an ideological claim. It is simply the machine. A nation inherits its constraints. Then it either builds around them, or it carries them downstream. Japan's challenges are real, but they are not unique. Every nation has foundational constraints. The question is not whether those constraints exist. The question is whether resilient systems have been constructed around them. Recognition is not resilience. This content is brought to you by Bobby Giggs. Promote your brand here and reach a wide audience across platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Follow the links in the description to get started. Section 4. Comparative lessons. The United States learned this lesson the hard way. The oil shocks of the 1970s showed what energy dependence looks like when foreign events become domestic economic problems. Energy stopped being an input. It became leverage. America eventually concluded that the only durable answer was greater energy security and domestic production capacity. That project took decades. China reached a similar conclusion through a different path. China is doing its best with infrastructure rollout, AI, and embodied AI. This structure took 20 to 30 years to build, and it starts with cheap energy. China does not have the natural oil and gas advantages of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, the United States, or Canada. So China had to build around the constraint: infrastructure, diversification, domestic capacity, strategic planning, resilience. Even then, China still has to contend with instability beyond its borders. That is the point. No country escapes the hierarchy. The only question is whether it understands the order of operations. Growth starts with energy security. The United States has spent 30 years strengthening its position. China has spent 30 years strengthening its own. Neither process was accidental. Neither process was quick. Which raises the obvious question: why haven't Japan and Europe solved energy security? Section 5. Supporting observations. Japan remains one of the most energy import-dependent advanced economies in the world. Its energy self-sufficiency rate remains exceptionally low. It continues to rely heavily on imported fossil fuels. More than 90% of its crude oil imports originate in the Middle East. That leaves Japan exposed to geopolitical disruption. It leaves Japan exposed to maritime choke points, and it leaves Japan exposed to events it does not control. Europe faces a different version of the same problem. The European Union remains significantly dependent upon imported energy. Recent energy shocks have demonstrated how quickly energy costs can become industrial competitiveness problems. This matters because neither Japan nor Europe has failed to recognize the importance of energy security. That is not the issue. The issue is structural resolution. Recognition is not the same thing as resilience. Knowing the problem exists is not the same thing as solving the dependency. Section 6. This is not an argument that energy security automatically produces growth. It does not. Energy can still be squandered through poor institutions, weak capital allocation, technological stagnation, political failure. Energy security is not sufficient for prosperity, but it may be necessary for durable growth. The order of operations diagnosis. This is an order of operations problem. Monetary and fiscal policy can redistribute pressure across time, sectors, and balance sheets. They can stabilize, they can delay, they can cushion, but they cannot permanently substitute for productive capacity. Interest rate policy cannot produce domestic energy reserves. Currency intervention cannot eliminate geopolitical choke points. Financial engineering cannot repeal geography. These are downstream solutions being applied to upstream problems. That is the pattern. And once you see the pattern, the question changes. The question is no longer only, what should we do? The better question is, what must exist first? That question sits at the center of the order of operations thesis. Section 7. Successful outcomes may depend as much upon satisfying prerequisite dependencies as they do upon selecting the correct strategy itself. The correct recipe matters, but so does the sequence. Correct things done in the wrong order can still produce fragile outcomes, because successful systems appear to exhibit preferred orders of construction. They build in layers. Foundations establish the prerequisites upon which later capabilities depend. When those dependencies are respected, systems become more resilient. They become more adaptable. They become more capable of compounding over time. When those dependencies are ignored, fragility accumulates downstream. Section 8. Conclusion. The lesson is simple. Before monetary stability, there must be productive growth. Before productive growth, there must be energy security. And before energy security, a nation must confront the physical, geographical, and resource constraints that determine what is possible. Japan's economic symptoms may therefore be better understood not as isolated failures. They may be downstream manifestations of unresolved foundational dependencies. That is the pattern. And the pattern is portable. Growth may be an invariant, but before growth, there is energy security. Flint West signing off.